Today's guest, Antonella Lettieri, is a translator working between English and Italian. Her translations include Maria Grazia Calandrone's Your Little Matter, Roberta Recchia's All That Is Left of Life, and Matteo Melchiorre's The Duke, which is currently longlisted for the International Booker Prize 2026. She was the National Center for Writing Emerging Translator Mentee for Italian in 2023 and won the John Dryden Translation Competition in the same year. Her translation of Maria Grazia Calandrone's Your Little Matter was granted the 2024 Pen Grant for the English translation of Italian literature and recently won the 2025 TFS Translation Prize. Here she is, Antonella Lettieri, on Harshananeeyam podcast.
I have always been really interested in reading and books. I was the classical child that is never seen without a book in her hands. I remember being told off because I wanted to read my book at the table whilst we were watching television, whilst we were doing all sorts of family activities. So that's definitely been something that's always been in my life. My mum, she's an elementary school teacher, so I think that I probably get that for her. Books are very important to her. There were always books in the house. As a child, I could ask for many toys or many things, and sometimes there was a yes and sometimes there was a no as an answer. But whenever I asked for books, it was always yes, because that was always very important to my family. So I've always been fond of reading. I've always been fond of stories, and I've also read a lot, and books have been a big part of my life throughout the years. Because I grew up in Italy, because I'm Italian, I think that I was probably exposed to translated literature and in general just to translated media much sooner than perhaps a child who grows up with English as a native language is. I obviously would watch TV, and most likely those would be American TV shows or American films that were dubbed in Italian, and I would read the books, and perhaps those were classic from English literature from the 1800s, and I would not necessarily realize that those books had not been written originally in Italian. So I think that, as for many children, the realization that what I was consuming was in translation perhaps only kind of like dawned on me gradually. I can't really say I fell in love with translation or with translated literature, because translated literature has always existed in my life, and probably at a certain time of my childhood, I didn't even know that I was consuming it at all. But I think that when I was a teenager and I was, I guess, becoming more interested in literature and its structure, starting to kind of like explore different things. For example, I got interested in Russian literature. So of course, as you kind of like start to expand your horizon of your readings, of course you understand that there's so much out there, and not all of it is in Italian and not all of it is in English. And so I think that it probably was when I was in secondary school that the idea of becoming a translator really kind of like started taking root in me, and it just seemed like the coolest thing in the world. You get to read books, you get to write books, you don't have to come up with the idea for a book, and you get paid for it. It's just like, where's the catch? I'll probably have some answers to that now, but at that time it really felt like a dream. And I think that I always wanted to become a translator because of that. So when I went to university, I studied modern languages. I studied English and Russian. So those are my two main languages, although unfortunately I've never really kept up with my Russian. So even though I can still read a few elementary sentences, I really don't dare to do much more than that. But yes, whilst I was at university, I got really interested in translation as a profession, and mostly I got interested in literary translation. I wanted to be a literary translator. So I started doing kind of like as much as I could within my degree that had to do with translation. We had a few electives, so I tried to kind of like take all the classes, do all the workshops and so on. And that really cemented the idea that I wanted to be a translator. But at that time, I was living in Italy. I was studying in Bologna. And my ambitions had all to do with becoming a literary translator into Italian, from English into Italian, because that's kind of like the done thing. I didn't even suspect that you could try and do it the other way around. So I kind of like tried to do that timidly for a little bit. I would try to get in touch with publishing houses and so on, but that was never very successful, and perhaps I didn't really have the wherewithal to kind of like actually pitch myself as a competent translator. So that kind of like really fizzed out into nothing, and not much happened at that time. But what happened after university was that I became a commercial translator. And so I started working a lot with corporate clients and just like in general, whatever kind of like contract, brochure, catalog and whatnot that came my way. And I think that deep down, I always hoped that that would be kind of like a stepping stone towards literary translation. But I think that it took me only a couple of years to realize that the two words are completely separate. There's not really a lot of talk. There's not really a lot of kind of like inter-exchange between the two industries. And so I kind of like felt for a long time as if I was stuck in commercial translation. And at the same time, commercial translation was starting to undergo the same transformations that, are still in effect today, and that obviously are now touching also many more industries, creative industries, especially with the introduction of AI. AI obviously wasn't necessarily around yet as such, but there was machine translation. And so that was really, really changing the landscape of commercial translation. And I must say it was changing it in a direction that really did not interest me. I wasn't necessarily too keen on it, on the commercial side of translation to begin with. And copy editing or just proofing the output of machines is not really something that I'm particularly interested in. So I think that's also because of the kind of like the early signs of a crisis in the industry. I decided to try and pivot my career around and finally kind of like pursue the thing that I really wanted to do. But also, I guess it wasn't just that. It was also because of a sort of like journey of personal growth that I was on. I was in my late 30s. I knew that I had ambitions that had not been fulfilled yet. And so it started feeling like now is the time to seriously try to go for it and make it happen. And so I kind of like got serious about it. I started applying for opportunities. I started attending the workshops. Those were also the times of the pandemic. So it was very lucky because a lot of events were happening online. And so there was a lot of opportunity to access information, expertise from more experienced colleagues without necessarily having to commit a lot of time or a lot of money. So it was fortunate in a way, in a very unfortunate time, but that was fortunate for me. But in the meantime, the other thing that had happened, a few years earlier, was that I had moved from Italy to the UK, where I live now. I'm based in London. And it really has been a long process of apprenticeship for me to decide or to accept the fact that I could translate into English. So that also was part of this personal growth, of this kind of like coming to terms with the fact that there's no right or wrong way to do something. You can do it or not, and if you can do it, then you're doing it. There's no recipe. And so I tried doing it. I saw that I could do it, and I just decided to go for it. And it worked out, I'd say.
Absolutely. You are a mentee at National Center for Writing at Norwich. Can you tell us about that experience?
Being chosen as the mentee in the Emerging Translator program that every year is organized at the National Center for Writing was definitely a pivotal point in my career. And it is part of this kind of like process of growth that I was talking about. Like, I've learned so much from that experience, and I couldn't recommend it more to anyone who's out there thinking about it, daydreaming about it. It was just wonderful. I learned so much, but I think that the biggest takeaway from the whole experience was the confidence to call myself a translator. I came out feeling like this is something that I can do. And I think that the mentorship, from this point of view, it gives you a little, it gives you the opportunity to make that kind of like a very small leap that, however, when you're just starting out, is huge, feels huge, to go from aspiring translator to emerging translator. And it might sound like it's just semantics. It might sound like, well, you're splitting hair here, but it really isn't like that. Because when you're an aspiring translator, it's just like nothing but a daydream in your head, just something that you're thinking like, wouldn't it be nice if I could? But when you're an emerging translator, someone has picked your work. Someone has gone through your work, edited it, proved it. Other people have read it. It's out there. And so it really, really brings about a massive shift in your confidence. And that was the most precious thing that I could receive at that moment. I think that translators and other creatives as well, but especially translators, due to the nature of the work, often talk about how they feel like imposters, the so-called imposter syndrome. And I mean, we all struggle with it. I still struggle with it. I know colleagues with 20 years experience that still struggle with it. So that's just part and parcel of being human beings. That's fine. But when you're just beginning, it can be so hard to overcome. And I think that these programs are wonderful, just at offering you a chance.
Who was your mentor at National Center for Writing?
It was Howard Curtis. Yeah, it was lovely. Working with him was absolutely lovely. He read my translations so carefully. And at times that can feel kind of like brutal, because it's just like, oh my God, there's so many changes, there's so many edits. But it's also like, you're never really going to get that level of attention again, unless until you sign your first contract, and then you're working to kind of like the editing phase of your first translation. But yes, receiving that level of support, that level of scrutiny even, but also that level of just like showing you the ropes, like this is a good rhythm for a sentence. This isn't. This is good syntax. This sentence works, flows. This doesn't. Oh, that's just so precious. And then after that, there was also kind of like coming out from that program, you also have a sort of like seal of approval. Obviously, it's a very prestigious way to introduce yourself. You might still be someone who has very little to show of their work, but still you have kind of like been vetted in a way, and you can, that is kind of like a currency that definitely opens you some doors. It was very, very useful also from that point of view. But the one thing that I would like to say to people who are thinking about applying is please do. But the other thing that I would like to say to people who are thinking about applying and can't for whatever reason, or to people who have applied in the past and haven't been lucky enough to be selected, is that is not the only way into the profession. When I was attending those conferences or, those Zooms, as I said earlier, I think that at one point I felt like, oh, of course these people have made it because they have done this, they've had this opportunity. And I can't deny that it's an amazing privilege to be selected for it. But in the meantime, I've also met so many colleagues who have come, even recently, into the profession in so many other ways. And the mentorship is wonderful, but it's just another way, simply another way to put your work out there. And once your work is out there, people will read it. And if it's good, you will find your readers. So it's just like, it's great. If you have a chance to apply, please do. But if you don't get in, or if you can't apply, don't be discouraged either. There's a lot of other ways into the profession.
Are you also into non-literary type of translations too?
Much less. Not necessarily because I want to. Obviously, it's a good way to bolster my income. But unfortunately, as I said, the industry has changed quite a lot. And there just aren't as many opportunities. And the ones that are out there are not particularly good. Rates have dropped. The kind of work that's asked of translators, well, we're not even called translators anymore, we're called linguists, because what we do is not really translate, it's just like kind of like go with a red pen through some kind of like machine slop. So it's not the same thing. I still do it occasionally, especially if it's a well-paid or a well-paid project or something I can do relatively quickly. But I'm not doing it much, especially because literary translation is now taking up most of my time. And it's not just literary translation, doing books, but there's other activities such as doing samples, reading for scouts, preparing readers' reports. So my days tend to fill up with that kind of work. I would say like that the kind of like the difference in the kind of work. Obviously translation is translation, so there are many overlaps. Obviously, literary translation tends to be more creative, whilst when you're talking about commercial translation, usually precision is kind of like the most important aspect of what people look at. But I think that in my experience, at the very least, with the kind of clients I've worked with in the past, is that what you get with literary translation that you don't really get with commercial translation is a sense of ownership and authorship of the text. When you work as a commercial translator, you are just like one gear in a long kind of like a series of steps, and usually you never really get any feedback. Usually you never really get any say on how your translation is used later on or edited or whatnot. And usually when you're working as a commercial translator, the only time you hear back is if there's negative feedback. You have missed this, you have got this wrong, the tone is not right and the client has complained. That's usually the only feedback you get. Whilst when you're working with literary translation, there is a real sense of ownership. There is a real sense of authorship of the text, not just because you are the writer together with the original author, of course, but also because especially in the current ecosystem where translators are also basically scouts. So they are finding texts, they are pitching them, they're convincing publishers that it's really worth going for a certain title. And then they're also involved, obviously, in all the stages of editing, as it should be, but they might even be involved in marketing, in promotion, in talking about the book, or even in kind of like imagining how the publisher should be presenting the book on the market. So it's like, I feel like I am a part of the entire process of bringing a book into English. And so that is particularly interesting and something that I wasn't necessarily even prepared to when I made the jump, because it starts from the very beginning. You're most likely the first person to have read the book, and you're then kind of like, and it ends when you're on your podcast talking about it, and which is, the best thing in the world.
Antonella, what are you currently working on?
So I have just delivered the edited text of a novel that I am doing for Foundry. So Foundry Editions, which are the publisher of The Duke. This is going to be my third book with them. We have a wonderful working relationship, and we have just finished working on a novel that will come out in the UK at the end of 2026, or towards the end of 2026. And it's a wonderful, very funny, very clever, very moving a satire based around local elections in a small town in Puglia. And the author is called Antonio Galetta. He's very young. This is his debut novel. And with it, he has won a very prestigious prize in Italy, the Premio Campiello Opera Prima, which is awarded to debuts. So it was judged as the best debut of last year. And the publisher and I are very, very excited for readers for English language readers to approach this satire. I think we will have more to talk about when the book is actually out, and we kind of like can highlight what we did there. But there was definitely something really interesting going on in the process of translating satire, because obviously satire is something that is it's very difficult because it's very ingrained in the place where it's set. And so to kind of like adapt it to a different setting and to make it work, and for it not to read as a simple parody, I think that we had to do something quite creative with it. And obviously the author was absolutely on board with it, and the editor/publisher was also absolutely on board with it. And I'm also now working on a memoir. So this is going to come out a bit later in 2027, I think. And it's a wonderful memoir about a serious mental health condition. And it's a book that is very bleak, but also very lyrical, and offers a kind of like unheard of point of view into the workings of a mind that unfortunately is quite ill. So it's a very unique access point into something that most of us will be lucky enough never to experience in our life. But I think that reading about it can teach us a lot of empathy towards the people who are unfortunately struggling with it.
Now, The Duke, which is longlisted for the International Booker Prize 2026, is written by Matteo Melchiorre. It's his debut novel. Please tell us about him.
So Matteo Melchiorre is a young, very interesting author from Italy. As you say, The Duke is his debut novel, but it's not the first book he's written. He has written some very interesting non-fiction books surrounding history and also the environment of the mountain and the woods. So it is interesting. What the main themes of The Duke are definitely part of his broader interest, something he has been thinking about and writing about for a very long time. By his background, by education, he's a historian, and I think that once you start reading the book, that will definitely won't come as a surprise. And he is especially interested, I think, in the history of the mountain, also as a social circle or a social environment. So for example, he has written this wonderful non-fiction book about a certain path in the mountains around where he's from and around where he lives that has been basically lost to time because a new road for cars was built, but he made it kind of like sort of a part of his obsession to understand where the path exactly went and to kind of like walk it. But also in doing so, he went into the history of how this path was particularly important for the economy of the region. And so it's like his interest is hyper-local. I think that he's very interested in writing about very small places, a very circumscribed environment. But I think that he uses that almost as a petri dish to look at global phenomenon. So like is very interested in looking at a small place to understand bigger dynamics at play. Like in a small village, those dynamics might be just more visible and more clearly distinguishable than in the globe at large. But still, it's the same. What happens in the tiny place happens all over the world.
Of course, it paid off. Now, what is the novel The Duke is all about?
Yes, so The Duke is not a family saga, but is a novel that I believe reads like a 19th century novel, but is very firmly grounded in the 21st century. So it's the story of, I sometimes like to talk about it as a year of madness. At first we're introduced to this character. He is known as the Duke. That's a nickname. We learn just a short while into the book. And he lives in this tiny village called Molorgana. It's at the foot of a mountain. And he lives a very kind of like smaller life in a way. He has his house, he has his land, and he tends to it. He's very privileged in the sense that he is the last heir of a noble family, so he has a title he doesn't care much for, but more importantly, he has financial resources that allow him to live a very leisurely life. He can just devote himself to his interests and hobbies rather than having to work like most of us do. But aside from that, he's definitely privileged, but he doesn't live a very privileged life and he doesn't behave like a very privileged person. So he is very kind of like almost withdrawn in himself. He likes his old books, he likes his old family stories, he likes the archive, he likes going for long walks, apart from the fact that he's a duke and he has plenty of money to spend on everything that's kind of like takes his whim, he's just a very normal person. And when we meet him, we have the impression that he's a very resolved person, that he knows himself, that he knows what he wants, that he knows what makes him happy, and that he's very content with his life. And for a little while, we believe him, as it were. But then we start kind of getting the suspicion that that's not really quite enough for him. He's living a very settled life, but we start realizing that he feels lonely, he misses his family, and perhaps, there's just something missing in his life. It could be another person, it could be anything. But this is the Duke as we meet him. But what really kind of like propels the novel is a feud that kind of breaks out between the Duke and what we could dub as the real lord of the village of Valorgana. That's Mario Fastreda, and he is a farmer, he's a cattle breeder, and basically kind of like the Duke and Fastreda, who is his sort of nemesis, kind of like come to represent two different kinds of privilege. The Duke has the privilege of social status and old money, and Fastreda instead, he is the kind of like self-made man, the man who pulled himself up from his bootstraps, and now he is the most powerful man in a tiny village, granted, but still, around there, he's the boss. Nothing happens without his say-so. And so they get into this fight, this argument, and the argument is the most preposterous thing, really. Like, they are fighting about some lumber that was felled, and was it within boundaries and was it outside boundaries, but then actually maybe the boundaries aren't where they are supposed to be. And if I talk about it, it sounds like the most boring plot ever. But when you read the book, it's actually something so exciting, because this kind of like pretext really is a way for this conflict between two worldviews to come to a head. And so this kind of like really peaceful character that we met at the beginning is now suddenly faced with a choice. Should he just kind of like roll over and let this self-proclaimed despot of the little village just do whatever he wants, including steal some land from him? Or should he instead do what his ancestors would have done, and so fight back viciously, ferociously, to preserve the status quo, to preserve what is his? And, when you put it like that, neither of these characters seem particularly sympathetic, but the book is told from the in first person, from the point of view of the Duke. It's the Duke that is telling the story. And once you are inside his interiority, you can actually see all of his complex and all of his complexity. So it's like a story that from the outside, we might feel like, who cares? It's just two rich people fighting. Why would I be bothered? But when we see it from the interiority of the Duke, we understand the complexity and all that is at stake. And I think that what is at stake in the book is, first of all, a reflection on privilege. So it's like, what is privilege, first and foremost, but also, how do you live a good life? How can you be a good person when you are born with a certain level of privilege? And so I think that is one of the most important questions of the book. But the second important question is also like, how do we move on from history, which doesn't mean how do we forget history, but it means how do we understand history, how do we study it, and then we move on from it. And I think that these are extremely modern and contemporary issues. So, like, as I said, it reads like it's, a realist novel from the 1900s, from the 1800s, but it's actually asking questions that are very modern and contemporary. Obviously, it's not talking, for example, in terms of colonialism or, the legacy of the West and, over the rest of the world. But in the same way that we were saying earlier, like this hyper-local also speaks to the global, like the same conflict that we see under the microscope in a tiny village is actually deals with questions that all of us around the world, wherever we are and whatever our background, we need to interrogate. And so I think that that's one of the really interesting things about the book, is that talks about something so small to mean something that is so global.
The novel almost runs into 500 pages. How did you handle the translation?
Yeah, so the book is long. It's not that long. I think that there's longer novels, but it's definitely a long book. And it took time, and it took a lot of care, and it took a lot of attention and focus. It took me probably about 9 months to translate, and obviously that then, there would be some extra time after that for the different rounds of editing and proofreading. But working on it really was great. It's a bit daunting. It was a bit scary at the beginning because I think that the language is so beautiful in Italian, and so I felt like I felt hugely intimidated by it, and by, I questioned a lot my ability to render it into English. But I think that with a book like The Duke, the truth is that translating is almost easy. It's not easy. That's not true. But it's easy in the sense that when a book is so well written, when a book is so carefully constructed, it's almost easy for it to find its way into the translation, in the sense that it's going to take a lot of trial and error, of experimenting with voice, experimenting with solutions, trying one thing and then changing it. It's not straightforward. But the book exists in the Italian in a very, very strong way. It's a very kind of like unique. It has a very unique personality. And so when you try to put that into English, it really comes across. And this is true for The Duke, but I think it's true for any book that is particularly literary, but particularly well crafted. So, yeah, I'm almost tempted to say that it was easy. It really wasn't easy. It took me a long time, and it took me a lot of agonizing over every single choice. But it feels like, a book like that has a huge drive, has a huge energy that propels it forward, and that is bound to seep through the translation. And hopefully it did, to an extent that readers can appreciate in English as well. I think that the challenge, like the biggest challenge, and obviously it was the biggest challenge, but also the most exciting thing about it, was to translate the voice. The voice is so unique. It's very unique in Italian, and I think that the English as well reads as something quite unique. As you said, nobody really speaks like the Duke, and in a way, thank God for that. It would be very odd if we did. But yes, I guess crafting that voice took a long time, took a long reflection. And it was only when I kind of like basically almost started talking as the Duke myself and writing as the Duke myself. I was like, okay, I think I'm getting this. I think I'm inhabiting it enough to kind of like feel confident that I could see it through. So it's like I think I've spoken some other time of how a sort of grammar, I needed to craft a sort of grammar for the Duke because his expressions in Italian are so specific and sometimes so marked. And it really was important to kind of like carry that across. And because obviously the two languages, they're not, they don't necessarily overlap. For example, the Duke in Italian has a really strong penchant for superlatives, which is words that end in issimo and issima. And that doesn't really exist in English, not in the same way that it exists in Italian. And if I started saying like very at every adjective, that would be very pedestrian and quite boring right away. So I had to come up with something that could work in English and that had a sort of like antiquated flavor to it. So often when the Duke uses a superlative in Italian, my option was to use most. So it would say like, for example, not very tall, but most tall, or, obviously I'm making up examples now, but readers of the book will certainly be able to see that there's a lot of like superlatives expressed with most. And so, there's hundreds of tiny little decisions like this that I took over the months that I was working on the Duke. And as a whole, they all contribute to crafting a voice.
How many days you took to complete the first draft?
The first draft, good question. I think the first draft took me 2 months. That's probably with also working at something else. Usually, I tend to do like I'm most productive and kind of like brightest, I suppose, in the morning. So if I have the ability to organize my time in the way that I prefer, I tend to do translation work in the morning and then kind of like either revising or any kind of like other work, as I said, reader supports and all sorts of other.
Do you have any target number of words or number of pages per day?
I tend to aim for 4,000 words a day in the morning.
Wow.
Doesn't always work out. That's my goal, but it kind of like depends on the text. It depends on, how switched on my brain is and so on. And also it depends on how early in the project it is. Like the first few chapters tend to be slower because you're still working out quite a lot. You're still understanding quite a lot of the problems that the text poses. And then as you kind of like carry on, I think you acquire a certain sure-footedness about the whole thing, and you kind of like know where you're going. But the way I've come to kind of like understand it now is that for me, it feels almost as if the first draft is just, it's a way to get something on the page, and I will revise it many, many times. I will go through a book probably, I don't know, at the very least, I want to say 6, 7, sometimes 10 times. So the first draft is really just like a sort of like early vomiting on the page of words that are going to get kind of like changed and edited so many times over the course of the whole process. But I think that the real interesting thing about the first draft is that I see it as a way to interrogate the text and ask it, what problems are you going to give me? Like, what are we dealing with here? So what are the challenges that you present? Because sometimes, obviously, I read a book in Italian before I start any translation. I would definitely read the book once, if not more times, in Italian. But it's not always easy to understand what the real challenges of the translation are when you're reading. It's only when you actually start doing that you go like, oh, Houston, we have a problem. This is going to be complicated. So I think that the first draft is really interesting because it just throws a lot of problem at you. And then from the second draft onwards, you start resolving those problems. And hopefully by the time you get to the final one, none of the problems are there.
Great. Now, please read an excerpt from the novel The Duke in Italian.
Yes, I would love to. I am also very happy to read in Italian. Ricordo che quella sera mi fermai sul parapetto della corte a guardare il panorama notturno. Val Organa, ai piedi del dorso prativo, a metà del quale sta la villa dei miei avi, era come un'isola appena illuminata. Per il resto, uniformemente, solo buio. Era buia la campagna intorno al paese, era buia la Valfonda, un lunghissimo fiordo che si spinge da Val Organa verso il mondo aperto. Era buio il greto dei sassi nel quale scorre la poca acqua del torrente Fragolfo, che nel corso delle ere ha scavato appunto la Valfonda. Anche il cielo, va da sé, era buio, poiché non si vedeva una stella. Soltanto laddove sapevo che la Valfonda andava infine riversandosi nella piana, potevo scorgere un bagliore aranciato che montava nel cielo, un bagliore più denso e più vivo, quasi sul limite del contemplabile, in corrispondenza del respiro luminoso, per fortuna assai lontano, in un altro mondo, della città di Berua. Ma il buio più spesso stava come sempre alle mie spalle, dietro alla villa, dove la massa incombente nerissima della montagna veniva su di colpo fra costoni e versanti. Vasta e leggermente concava, boscosa, porta di altre montagne via via più acute e più aspre, fino a diventare unicamente roccia. Questa montagna, che si chiama la montagna, come fosse l'unica possibile montagna, per noi di Val Organa è una presenza ineludibile, tant'è che anche di notte non solo la si avverte, ma si continua a vederla, poiché è capace di un buio denso, profondo, centripeto, che la scolpisce più nera nel circostante buio. A ogni modo, allorché il mondo si trova immerso in questi abissi oscuri, la villa dei miei avi, all'opposto della montagna, trattiene invece una sua fievole fosforescenza, che la rende non troppo diversa da una roccia nuda, spoglia, biancastra, e parrebbe davvero pura la roccia se non fosse prodotta da un pensiero matematico, rigoroso. Il portale ad arco giusto al centro della facciata, le trifore perfettamente allineate, gli spigoli netti, le finestre ottimamente cadenzate, il timpano svettante e infine, accanto al timpano medesimo, i due camini, altissimi, affusolati come guglia. Dopo che trascorsi nel buio della corte poco meno di una mezz'ora, sentì un rumore oltre la corte, in fondo al prato, tra le siepi dei noccioli. Poteva essere un capriolo, poteva essere un tasso, una volpe o forse il vento, o forse niente. Mi parve tuttavia che nel prato si muovessero delle ombre, che sul colmo del timpano sbandierasse uno straccio, che all'interno della villa, nel salone al primo piano, vi fossero occhi bene aperti. Per chi viva in una casa come la mia e stia per entrarvi calato il buio, non è infrequente avere di queste fantasie, ma bastano i giri della chiave nel portone perché queste stesse fantasie tornino a rintanarsi nei loro angoli, restituendoci alla realtà. Il fatto è che la chiave della villa, capace di ammazzare in un istante inquietudini e fantasie, quella sera non c'era. Non era nella giacca, non era nelle tasche dei pantaloni, non era in macchina. E allora vidi la mia mano distratta che posava la chiave sul bancone del bar, da rubino, scordandosi poi di riprenderla.